So I'd like to begin. My name is Melinda Jones. I'm the National President of National Council of Jewish Women of Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to remind everybody that the issue of where we live is such an important part of who we are. The issue of how we live as Jews in Australia, in this wonderful land, and how we're related to the land of Israel. What happens in Australia is important to us as Australians, and what happens in Israel to the women is important to us as women and as Jewish women. The land is important. And I must remind you that we have the referendum coming up later in the year, and that we will be doing a session on what the referendum means for women, or everything women might want to know about the referendum, hopefully with a slightly different perspective than you often get. But it's in early July. Watch your email address and you'll get something there. So let me then acknowledge the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land where I sit, and pay my respects to elders past and emerging. I'd now like to hand over to Leanne Basser, who knows Ruth, and I don't know if she knows Leah, but she's worked in this area as we have together for many years. So Leanne, would you like to introduce our speakers?
With pleasure. It is an enormous pleasure to welcome Ruth and Leah. Ruth and I have a long-standing friendship with many interests in common. Ruth is an internationally recognised scholar. She is the founding director of the Rackman Center for the advancement of the status of women at Bar Ilan University. But she is so much more than that, an expert in family law, an expert in women's rights. For 9 years, she sat on the committee of the convention, of the Women's Convention at the UN, and she chaired it for 2 terms. So that would be around 6 years. 3 years, 3 years vice chair on that committee. She hasn't stopped her international work, but is now focused on the very urgent situation in Israel. Most recently, just I don't know, a month or 2 ago, a second edition of essays on the Women's Convention was published, and Ruth's one of the co-editors of that collection. Leah, welcome to NCJWA, and it's good to have you here as well. I haven't had the honour of meeting you yet, but I'm sure I'm looking forward to it next time I'm in Israel, which will probably be next year. Leah has an MA in Gender Studies from Bar Ilan and a law degree, LLB, from the Herzliya Interdisciplinary Institute, as well as a BA from Smith College. She joined the Rackman Center 3 years ago in 2020 as Manager of External Relations, and recently started working in the Centre's policy unit. She's been a professional writer, a consultant, also working in the non-profit sector, and has worked for a number of Israeli organisations in various fields, including youth or young adults at risk, women in the area of women's rights, education, Jewish Renaissance, pluralism, shared society, health, and more. So many of us have many things in common with you too, Leah. She strongly believes in the importance of transparent and close relationships between organisations, government, and philanthropy, and their role in building a strong democratic Israel. Leah grew up in Chicago and made Aliyah in 2002. She lives in the centre of Israel with her husband and 4 children. So welcome to you both. And I'm guessing I'll hand over, well, you'll say who's going to speak first.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leanne, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you, Melinda, for giving us the opportunity to present. We had a short chat before everybody came in, and I just said that we are so grateful for any opportunity that we now have to share our concerns, to raise awareness, and hopefully lead to more involvement And I'll explain, of course, the whole presentation will give you the background and the reasons for this. But I will just put on our PowerPoint presentation. And I will ask Leah to start with a very short recap of the Rackman Center, where we both come from, what our role is within Israel in general and the current situation in particular. And then I'll take over and start with the presentation of what's happening now in Israel for the past half a year, 6 months, and how is it affecting us women. So Leah, please.
Thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon here, good evening to everyone there. Pleasure to be here with you. And many of you I haven't met before, so it's nice to meet you. I'm not going to go through my whole bio again. I will just say my name is Gessinger Levy. And my position in Rackman Center, I'm the head of external relations and resource development. And as Ruth said, before we get into the heart of our discussion today, just wanted to take a moment about what the Rackman Center is, why our work today is so important. So Ruth, can you move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So the Rackman Center was founded in 2001. We sit at the Faculty of Law, Bar Ilan University. We use the law as a tool for social change, primarily law in Israel, which is governed exclusively by religious law. We strive to solve the status of women, free them from unwanted marriages, empower them economically, protect women and their children from domestic and legal abuse, and create legislation and policy that enshrines all of this into law. How do we do this? The circle on your screen.
We have a problem with the sound.
I think I had a momentary internet lapse.
Yeah, okay.
Can you
Now
hear me
we
now?
hear you
Fantastic,
much
you're
better
back.
now. We hear you much
Okay.
better now, Leah. So start
Oh.
start from this
Okay.
slide.
So I'll start with this slide. I apologize for that. So how do we do this? All of our work. One, we provide pro bono legal representation of 40 cases annually before both the civil and the religious courts. Two, we provide pro bono legal consultation to about 600 women annually through a call-in helpline that we operate. Three, we provide emotional support to 100 women annually. Four, we are very active in advocacy and promoting legislation in the Knesset and government ministries. We also submit petitions to the High Court of Justice as an additional path to influence policy. And finally, as an academic center at a major university, we research the status of women under Israeli law, and we share these findings with legal professionals, judges, decision makers, and law students. All of our policy work is backed by fact-driven theory that makes our voice the most convincing. The Rackman Center is the only institution of its kind in Israel, and as far as we are aware, the only institution of its kind in the world. We are unique because of our dual track model. We approach each element of our strategy from two directions. So first, we are involved in bottom-up cause lawyering alongside top-down advocacy. As part of the university, we create and have access to cutting-edge research, which we use to influence policy and win cases for our clients. We both cooperate with the government when possible to influence policy, and we work independently as needed. As I mentioned before, we sit at Bar Ilan University. Bar Ilan is identified Israel is a religious-leaning institution. Therefore, we have unique access to the religious courts in the religious world alongside civil courts and the secular world. Our direct services include both legal support and emotional support to women that provides a holistic care package. And finally, we work primarily within Israel domestically, but we also work internationally, for example, at the UN, to fight for women's rights in Israel. I will add that while we do sit at Bar Ilan University, we have a separate and completely independent budget. 100% of it comes from philanthropic donations. So in summary, our presence is critical today because, as you will hear in a moment from Professor Halperin-Kaddari, many of the dangers facing women are rooted in the government's proposed policies to completely change the legal system, both the civil system and the religious system. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for the government, these are our areas of expertise. I now hand the mic over to Ruth.
Thank you very much, Leah. And I'll just add before I begin that my presentation today is based on more than 30 years experience as a researcher, teacher, a law professor at Bar Ilan University in Israel. My JSD is from Yale Law School. That was more than 30 years ago. And it is also based on more than 20 years of heading the Rackman Center for the Advancement of Women, and 12 years on the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW committee. So I think I do have a very vast and comprehensive overview, not only of Israel's politics and constitutional and legal framework, but also somewhat broader international perspective, which allows me to assess what's going on in Israel. And I'll give you the bottom line, be very, very, very concerned and troubled. We'll talk today about the Israeli government planned judicial reforms, as it is called by the government, and its impact on women. And I do assume that if you joined us today, you already have some knowledge of what's happening, but you might be a little confused because it is very complex. It is very difficult to follow. We are also confused and not always understanding what's really is taking place and what's happening. And you may also have many questions, and you can feel free to ask while I talk, but you can also maybe write questions on the chat, and we'll have time to do a Q&A at the end of my presentation. I want to add that on the personal level, whether it is me as a law professor, part of a consortium of law professors in Israel who are very, very involved in opposing the government's plan. And it's also me as the director of the Rackman Center, and all of us, Leah and the other staff of the Rackman Center, we practically stopped anything else that we have been doing. And our daily lives now focus and evolve around the resistance movement to these judicial reforms. It's very intense. It's very exhausting. It's not just every Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night demonstrating, and sometimes during the week. It's writing constantly, position papers, posts on the social media, doing talks and presentations like this, trying to move things behind the scenes, and just following, keeping track of what's happening. Extremely, extremely exhausting. And you can see this image here is from one of the demonstrations, the weekly protests in Tel Aviv, which is the largest, but there are more than 100 places over Israel where every Saturday night there are demonstrations. Probably close to 1 million people have already participated in these demonstrations. So do the math, equivalency to Australia. We are a nation of just a little below 10 million people. So it's 10% who have already taken place within these demonstrations. This is a quote, I'll just read it out loud. Women in Israel are facing the greatest threat to their status, their rights, their future, and their daughters' future since the establishment of the State of Israel. This is something that I said at the president's residency when we had a chance of meeting with the president a few months ago. And I know it's a very strong statement, but I do believe that it is very, very true. And the image here, if you're not certain what you're seeing, one of the main circles in Tel Aviv, surrounded by women dressed with garb from The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's dystopic novel and Netflix show. Maybe some of you have watched it. And it's a symbol for our protests as women, because we do believe that Israel is going in the direction, maybe not exactly as Gilead, but we are heading at that direction. Before we understand, before we want to talk about the dangers of these legal reforms, it is critical to first understand Israel's system of government and how it is different from any other democracy in the liberal democracy in the northern globe. And how it is different from the system which you're familiar with, namely Australia. So Israel is a parliamentary democracy with only one house in the parliament. But the main thing is that the parliament is totally controlled by the government. The government, which is formed from the coalition members, now consisting of 64 members of the parliament forming the parties that form the government, has in fact total control, the majority of the parliament, and there is practically no possibility to pass legislation without the approval of the government. And more than 90% of the laws that are being passed are in fact laws which are proposed by the government. So in other words, it's not really the parliament that legislates, it's in fact the government that is both the executive and the legislator. And there is this principle of coalition discipline, meaning that any member from the coalition must abide by the decisions of the government and is not allowed to object to a legislation, even if it contradicts her or his own personal beliefs. And unlike any other democracy except for the UK, but I won't go into that, we do not have an entrenched written constitution. There is no entrenched written Bill of Rights in Israel. There are basic laws, and it's important to note that two of these basic laws, which have been enacted in the early 90s, have been interpreted by the Supreme Court. And I'll say sometimes Supreme Court, sometimes I'll say High Court of Justice. It's the same institute, okay? So they have been interpreted by the Supreme Court as having a somewhat elevated level over other pieces of legislation and as giving the court, the Supreme Court, the power of judicial review, meaning that any other ordinary law that might contradict those rights which are in those basic laws, it's primarily the basic law of human dignity and freedoms. So any ordinary law that contradicts the basic law of human dignity and freedom might be overturned by the Supreme Court. But this is questionable. And this is one of the things that the judicial overhaul intends to turn over. And recall that it's only those rights that are enshrined in that particular basic law. It's very, very narrow. For instance, the right to equality is not mentioned in that basic law. So the right to equality, gender equality, national equality, racial equality, whatever equality, is not entrenched in constitutional law in Israel. And there is no basic law, there is no rule about what can be enacted as a basic law. So theoretically, and this is another thing which is planned by the government now, the government can actually enact any piece of legislation and give it the title of a basic law. And the next step of the plan is to say that basic laws cannot be reviewed by the court. In other words, if the government wants to enact a law that says that discrimination on the basis of religion or religious belief or national identity, of course, I'm going to extreme, right? But theoretically, it can enact such a law, title it basic law, and say that nobody can overturn it. The Supreme Court does not have the power to overturn it. And they have the majority to do that. Okay, so these are the dangers that we are facing. So we don't have any common checks and balances, which you do have in other liberal democracies. We don't have constitution, we don't have two legislative houses, we don't have the presidential veto, we are not a federal structure state, we don't have regional elections, it's only one system of central elections. We are not subordinated to any supranational court, such as the European Court of Human Rights. And we are not subject to any supranational organizations, such as the European Union. So sometimes we are being compared to Poland and to Hungary. You may have heard it, right? Many podcasts, and it's true, right? Because the Israeli government, we know for a fact that they actually went to study so that they can follow the Polish protocol and the Hungarian protocol, and they're doing that. They're doing it very, very successfully. But don't forget that both Poland and Hungary are part of the European Union, and they're subject to the European Court of Human Rights. We are not. Plus, Poland and Hungary are not in the situation of ongoing more than 50 years of occupation over a territory which is being disputed. And we are very much in that, and that's very much part of the current crisis and current critical situation. So the strong and independent legal system, judiciary, at the moment is the only effective check on the government. And this is what's now being planned to be overturned. Let's recall the very basic principle of a democracy, Montesquieu, which is separation of powers. On the left-hand side, you see the ideal. All three branches of government are separate from each other. Executive, separate from the legislative, separate from the judicial. Even now in Israel, as I said at the beginning, there is no real separation of powers because the executive, the government, totally controls the parliament, the Knesset, the legislator. And the judiciary is the only branch which is still independent and can perhaps exert some power over both the executive and the legislator. And now the plan after the reform is to swallow the judiciary under the power of the executive. So that's basically the plan. Now, how did we get here? Just, you know, to set the facts in the back of your mind. We start here in 2019. Of course, we could start in 1948 or even before, right? But we start with 2019 when the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the longest serving prime minister in the history of modern Israel. You know, my youngest daughter, who's now 22, she doesn't remember, right? She basically there may have been 3 years during her lifetime in which the prime minister was not Netanyahu, but her generation really does not know anybody else. In 2019, he was indicted with charges of breach of trust, bribery, and fraud. The trial, as you know, is still going on. And that started a political crisis where we had 5 rounds of elections in less than 3 years. Totally crazy. March 2021, for a very brief moment, the Bennett and Lapid leaders of 2 different parties, quite opposing parties, but they formed the Change Coalition, managed to oust Netanyahu. But this was a very, very short-lived coalition, and it failed not because it couldn't work together. In fact, that was the best government that we had in 2 decades in terms of operation. But Netanyahu and his party and right-wing allies relentlessly attacked individuals of this particular government and managed to bring it down. And so in November 22, Netanyahu led a right-wing bloc and won the elections to form the most extreme government in Israel's history. And just to give you an example how extreme it is, one of the parties that forms this coalition is called Jewish Power. And it's exactly as you hear it. It's in fact Jewish supremacy. That's the ideology of this particular party. And they are following the footsteps of the racist so-called Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was deemed illegitimate in the 80s and in the late 80s, was deemed illegitimate both legally and politically. And even the most right-wing Likud leaders at that time, for example, Yitzhak Shamir, they left the room when Meir Kahane took the podium to speak. And now Netanyahu opened the door, put a red rug under the feet of Itamar Ben Gvir, who is exactly the same racist, fascist follower of Meir Kahane. And then in January of 23, Justice Minister Yariv Levin, unveiled the governmental plan for a constitutional overhaul of the judicial system. Now, Levin had this plan in his mind for more than 12 years, and he kept proposing it to Netanyahu in his earlier governments, and Netanyahu kept opposing and objecting to the ideas and to the plans of Yariv Levin until he was indicted, until he now faces his own legal battle. So his whole worldview about judicial, the place of the judiciary and the judicial reform has changed. So what are the components of these proposed quote unquote reforms? First of all, to totally politicize the judicial appointments, to have the government, again, the executive, be in complete control of selecting the judges for all the judiciary in Israel, starting from the very lower courts to the district courts and courts of appeals to the Supreme Court, High Court of Justice, have the government be in total control over the committee for the judicial selection of judges. Second, to prohibit judicial review of basic laws. I mentioned it before. So any law can be titled a basic law, and the judiciary will not have a power of review to strike it down. Thirdly, to undermine judicial review of regular legislation. So as I already indicated, now the judiciary, the Supreme Court, does have the power to strike down a law that contradicts the basic law of human dignity and freedom. If the reform passes, there will be only a very, very narrow possibility, only within a majority of 12 judges out of the full 15 sitting in plenary. And then, even if they do strike it down, number 4 here is the override clause, which will give the parliament the power to reenact any ordinary law that may have been struck down by the High Court of Justice. Fifth, to dilute the judicial review over the executive branch. So, for example, right now, the government wanted to appoint former Minister Deri, who was already who was already convicted twice for bribery, and the government decided to reappoint him as a minister. That was struck down by the High Court of Justice as unreasonable. So they want to prohibit this ground of unreasonableness as a ground for the court to exercise judicial review over the decisions of the government. 6, and there are more, right? I only put here the main components of these reforms: to politicize and weaken the Attorney General, the standing of the Attorney General, so their advice and their professional assessment of the situation and the professional advice to the ministers, to the government, will not be binding. They can ignore whatever attorney generals of any government office and the main attorney general says. They can totally ignore it. That's what they want to propose. And how did we get here in terms of the political interests? So we have to bear in mind that this is a very peculiar point of time where there was alignment of interests from totally different directions to weaken. It all comes together to weaken the Supreme Court. First, we have the ultra-Orthodox parties, and they hold a long-term grudge against the court. They see the Supreme Court, they perceive it as the highest symbol of secularism, of liberalism, of anti-Jewish values. And they're angry at the Supreme Court that very often limited the powers of the rabbinical courts. And they also have a strong interest in maintaining the status quo where the ultra-Orthodox men are completely exempt from military service. And they receive very, very high benefits from the Social Security, right? If there is a welfare state remaining in Israel, it is in fact within relation to the ultra-Orthodox community. And they also want to maintain their complete exempt from mandatory core studies, such as math, English, Hebrew, and still receive all the budgets for their educational system. And they know that this will not hold for long if the Supreme Court remains as relatively strong as it is now. So that's their interest. Second, we have the religious Zionists, fundamentalist, messianic views of, as I mentioned before, Jewish supremacy, which also hold a very extreme perception of free market, of neoliberal or libertarian market ideology. Maybe you've heard the name of Forum Kohelet, perceive themselves to be a think tank. They are not really a think tank, they're a lobby group, but they have a very, very central role in all these plans that we're talking now. And at the bottom of their plan is their wish to de facto annex the West Bank, the occupied territories. And I can expand on that later, but let's leave it in that. But what these two groups have in common is a worldview which is totally opposing the principle of equality. It's an hierarchical worldview based on religious perceptions. Both the ultra-Orthodox and the religious Zionists, so-called religious Zionists, they oppose equality. They oppose gender equality. They oppose national, ethnic, religious equality. And they share these views together. So we have to understand that these are what opposing women, and that's why we are in such a dangerous situation. And Netanyahu's own personal interest in weakening the Supreme Court is obviously very, very obvious. He also wants to control the judges who will hear his case, who will hear the appeal of his case, and he wants to get out of jail free ticket. So turning to women, we have to recall that we came to this event, to this situation, from a very low starting point to begin with. First of all, there's no civil marriages and divorces in Israel, only religious marriages and divorces, and all the religions that control family law, marriage and divorce in Israel, they are all patriarchal, they all discriminate against women. We can argue which is worse for women, whether it's Judaism or Sharia or Druze law. Not going to go into that. But that's number one. Number two, we are in a decreasing rates of representation in public life, and we'll show the numbers in a minute. Number three, there is an increase in gender segregation and the phenomena of exclusion of women from public spaces, from the media, from office, from positions of power and decision-making. And there is increasing rates of domestic violence, starting with COVID, but not decreasing after COVID ended. And if we look at the regular indices indicating women's positions in any nation, we also look at the question of wage gaps. No decrease of wage gap in Israel for the past 10 or 15 years. So these are just, starting indications of where we come from, where we start. And here are the numbers of where we are at present following the most recent elections of November 22. Less than a quarter of the members of the parliament are women, only 29 women. But that's not the real indication. The real indication is how many women are within the coalition, because we already understand the full control of the government over the coalition. So it doesn't really matter whether we have many women in the opposition. They don't hold any power. We should look at those who hold power. So out of the 64 members of the parliament forming the coalition, only 9 are women. Moving on to the ministers. Out of 31 portfolios and 5 vice ministers, only 6 women ministers. That's really nothing. Knesset committees, parliamentary committees, only 4 women had Knesset committees out of 27. And director generals of offices, of governmental offices, out of 36 offices, only 1 woman director general. And I could give you more numbers of women who have previously had powers within the executive, and one by one, they were ousted, they were fired by the incoming ministers, like on a daily basis, we read it in the news. But how does weakening of the High Court of Justice, how is it going to affect us? If there are puppet judges and not real judges, right, as we see here in the picture, what's going to change with respect to women? And the answer is very, very simple. Because the High Court of Justice has been the defender, promoter, and champion of women's rights throughout the existence of the State of Israel. And I put here just 4 examples out of dozens and dozens of High Court of Justice cases, which in fact advanced, promoted, safeguarded women's rights. Maybe you've heard some of the names of these cases. In 1988, the Shakdiel case, where Leah Shakdiel wanted to be elected to serve at a religious municipal council, and the rabbinical authorities opposed that. So the High Court of Justice overturned their refusal to allow her to serve in a religious council. In 1995, the very famous Bavli case is the one where the High Court of Justice overturned the rabbinical court's decision to deny a woman's share in the marital property and to instruct the rabbinical courts to rule according to the civil law where it comes to questions of marital property. In 1996, the Supreme Court overturned the ban on female pilots within the military, within the IDF. In 2012, the Supreme Court invalidated a provision that denied the support for a woman with children. She was denied her Social Security benefit only because she had access to a car, a very, very old car. And the Institute for Social Insurance said, well, then she doesn't need the Social Security benefit. The Supreme Court invalidated this. So these are really just very, very few examples. What's going to happen if we have a weak Supreme Court and we don't have real judges, but just puppet judges, as we saw in the previous image? So let's take a hypothetical case, which is really not very hypothetical. If and when they decide to enact a law that requires the woman to sit at the end of the bus, de facto, the reality is that it's already happening. There are numerous and numerous of lines of buses where women are either not even allowed in or they're instructed to sit at the back of the bus. Right now, it's still illegal. So you can take your case to the court and you can require redress as a tort, as a discrimination. But if they pass a law that actually enacts this practice into law, will the High Court of Justice be able to intervene and to strike that law down? Probably not. Probably not. Because the right to equality, as I already said, is not expressly enshrined in the basic law of human dignity and liberty. But even if the impossible happens and they do strike it down, then, as I said, the Knesset can always reenact it and override it, and then there will be no possibility ever again to strike it down. And these are not hypotheticals. These are exactly what it's on the table, what lies ahead. And everything that I have here in these slides is based on the coalition agreements between the Likud party and the other parties that form the government. So I didn't invent anything. First of all, there is the law to expand the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts, which already passed the preliminary hearing and is now being prepared to go to the Knesset for a first and then second and third reading, and they have the majority to pass it. And that will mean that the rabbinical courts will actually have a jurisdiction over any civil matter, provided the parties agree, quote unquote, to be adjudicated there. But I'm asking you, think about this school teacher, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox school teacher, who badly needs the job to sustain her family, because obviously her husband doesn't work, he only goes to the yeshiva to study. So she needs that job. And then the headmister, which is always male, who is always male, requires her to sign at the employment contract, to sign that she agrees that if she has any claim against the school or the organization that employs her, she must adjudicate this claim at the rabbinical court and not at the labor court. Does she really have a choice to not agree to that? And that's, again, that's just one example, okay? Then there's the law to allow the expansion of gender segregation in public spaces, in cultural events, and in academia. We already have these gender separate tracks, even in law studies, in a number of academic institutes. The High Court of Justice, in fact, allowed it on narrow grounds with some limitations, and I can expand on that later. This bill proposes that to completely normalize gender segregation in academia, in cultural events, and so on and so forth. Going on the right-hand side, a law to actually legalize discrimination in provision of services on grounds of religious beliefs. That means that any shop owner can refuse to serve a woman whom he may think is dressed unmodestly and which contravenes his religious belief or other clients' religious beliefs. That will be legal. The refusal to join the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention is considered to be the gold standard in international women's rights for what a country has to do and must do in order to combat gender-based violence against women and domestic violence. And the previous government, after 6 years of work of the Rackman Center, truly led by us, by the Rackman Center, the previous government already reached was this short distance far from joining this convention. And one of the first sections in the coalition agreement between the Likud and the religious Zionists is not to join the Istanbul Convention, which is really crazy. I mean, instead of doing what we want to do to promote and to advance and to make the world a better place, right? They agree not to join and not to combat violence against women. So this is a Newsweek report about this. I think I want to leave time for questions, so I will not explain these further examples that are again on the table. I do want to end on a little bit somewhat optimistic note. And the optimistic note is to recognize the female leaders of the protest movement. So here we see an incredible woman, Dr. Shikma Bressler, and she's a physicist from the Weizmann Institute, very prestigious. And just like I started, she is one of those who left everything and completely devotes herself to lead the protests, to lead all the demonstrations every week. And you see her always with a flag, and the symbolizes these images. I don't think I need to expand on that. And then there are these incredible women, our Iron Ladies. Maybe you recognize the one on the left-hand side, who is the president of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Esther Chayut, who unfortunately is stepping down, retiring at the age of 70 this coming October. And that's our fear. Who is going to replace her? On the right-hand side, you see our Attorney General, Gali Bar Miara, who turns out to be really made of iron, does not bend for one moment, but obviously her position is in danger because they can decide just like that to fire her. They're not doing it because they know that the minute they do it, all hell will break loose and there will be 1 million people at the same time on the streets. And that's what keeps them from refraining from doing this act or other acts, that we are in constant danger that this will happen. So how can you help? You can help because this is the time where we need a direct involvement of world Jewry and Jewish women. That's mandatory. And I know, I mean, I have friends, I see here on the screen, many of you. I know that there is a constant dilemma of Jewish people, men and women alike, who do not live in Israel, who have always maintained the position that what happens in Israel is concerning Israelis. And you, not living in Israel, don't have a say in political decisions that are taking place in Israel. That's no longer true. Sometimes you also might think that criticizing Israel may be undermining the actual existence of Israel, and it would actually be interpreted as being against Israel. That's no longer true either. If you really want to support Israel and to have Israel be maintained as the state that you know and you love, you must be involved, and you must do anything and everything possible to oppose the government of Israel. It's not opposing Israel. It's opposing the current government of Israel, which is being engaged in completely turning around the character of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And what happens now in Israel concerns you no less than us Israelis. And I can also give you some examples of that later, but the direct involvement should be translated into direct pressure of the Israeli government in asking your local government to pressure Israeli government to spread the word in your communities and to continue to support us women's organizations who are holding strongly and anxiously to fight these reforms. So we really need you. Israel needs you. And by that, I'll end the presentation and open up for any questions that you may have.
Well, Ruth, we're all going to give you an enormous applause, and Leah too, of course, for the introduction. It's so fantastic that you've said to us there are things that we can do, but there are so many questions that we all have. And what I'm going to ask you to do, Danielle, do you want people to send messages to you, or do you want to people to raise hands?
Probably best if they raise hands, and then I'll call on them in an appropriate order.
So
people can message me as well if that's easier.
If you could use the reactions button, that would help. But before we take anyone from the floor, I do have one question I received from Vivian. Do you want to ask it, Vivian, or would you like me to ask it? I can't even see Vivian.
You go ahead, Melinda. That'd
Okay. I'm not actually going to read it. I receive Haaretz online, so we follow events closely. Notwithstanding the protests and the deep concern, almost 50% of Israelis voted for the parties that make up the government, i.e. they support the conservative religious and nationalistic views they voted for, politicians with criminal records. Is this proportion of the population in favour of Israel moving in the direction that's supported by Levin, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, etc.? Can you speak about who, beside the ultra-Orthodox, provided the government support? But perhaps we could take one step back and you can actually talk first a little bit about who supported the existing government and how they got elected, because that's, I think, an interesting thing to know.
Right. So I'll try to make it as short as possible. Much of the current result of the past elections was, I'm hesitating to say coincidental, but a lot of it was really coincidental. The difference between the bloc that eventually is leading the government and the opposition, Leah, maybe you remember the exact number, but the numbers were really slim. I think it was in the range of tens of thousands, not more than that.
I think that if I remember, it was 40,000 votes determined the difference, and that's what caused the fall of the Labour Party.
Exactly. That was a huge miscalculation on the part of the Labour Party, unfortunately led by a colleague of us, Meirav Michaeli, who refused to unite with the more left-wing Meretz party and completely lost representation. So there was a really small difference between the Labour Party having 4 members of the parliament and 0 members of the parliament, and they ended up with 0. And if that miscalculation had been prevented, we wouldn't be where we are. So that's number 1. Number 2, nothing of these legal judicial reforms overhaul plan was part of the Likud party's agenda prior to the elections. Nothing. Whoever voted for the Likud did not or was not aware that that's the plan. They had completely other things on their platform or on their agenda. The other parties, the much, much smaller parties, the Jewish Supremacy, Jewish Power Party, and the National Zionist led by Smotrich, they did talk about the need to reform the judiciary and the legal system, but even they did not go into these details, these so far-reaching ending democracy plan. So it's really, it's false to say that half of the Jewish population in Israel voted for these reforms. They may
I would also
that now. Okay, Leah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I would also add, I think those are two very important points. I would add also that after 5 elections, I think people were very, very frustrated on both sides. And a lot of people voted for, I think they just wanted a final decision. Like they wanted a government to be in power for 4 years, and they, voted
Stability.
right.
They wanted stability.
Stability, exactly.
Now, I don't have anyone with a formal hand up, but I did see someone before with their hand.
No, that was me. It was me. She can't see you.
Oh,
Hi, Leslie.
Just
Hello.
unmute yourself. Oh, Leslie, hi.
So I'm interested to know what the women around Netanyahu feel. Are they just brainwashed into this idea of what he has and the rest of them have? I mean, his daughter only knows him as the leader of the country. She's a young woman. Maybe she's at university. Has she been in the army? I don't know. But she and her friends, surely they must see what's going to happen to them.
Oh, definitely. The youngsters, there is also a lot of optimism in what's happening in Israel in these past months. And just I indicated the women heading the protest. It's unprecedented, this social movement, the hundreds of thousands of people walking to the streets every week for 25 weeks in a row. And the youngsters, we kept thinking during COVID and during the protests previously against the Netanyahu, we kept asking ourselves, where is the young generation? Thinking about the 60s in France, in Europe, in the US, everything was led by youngsters. So where are our youngsters? They are there now. They are there now. The students are leading protests. People out of the army are leading protests. A very, very strong movement within the protest is the young, and also not that young, reserve soldiers who clearly say that they will refuse to do their reserve service if parts of these judicial reforms are starting to be enacted. So there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope. We are all undergoing a very condensed and intense course in democracy and in democracy education. We also realize how lacking education for democracy has been in our educational system, and we are now compensating for that. Right? I said that we are engaged in writing position papers and publishing and conducting lectures, just lectures for voluntarily all over the country for groups of women, for groups of men, for groups of young people, just to give democratic education. Now, the people around Netanyahu, including women around Netanyahu, I don't want to sound patronizing or condescending, but the truth is that I do think that they are being brainwashed. Don't forget, I didn't mention the stronghold that Netanyahu has over the media. And here he follows in the exact footsteps of Berlusconi, who just passed away, right? Of Urban, of Duda in Poland, of Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, how did Erdogan mean, for God's sake, how did he win these past elections 2 weeks ago? Simply by controlling the media. So here also, we now have our very own equivalent of Fox News, which is getting stronger by the day. We didn't have that channel, Channel 14. It didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. It now passed the rating of the other main channels in Israel. And they completely broadcast complete fake, complete false reports, but people believe them. And it's, so your question is the same question as you can give to any supporters of any populist leader in the world, and Netanyahu belongs in that group. But as I try to explain, our situation is much, much more troubling and worrying than other nations led by populist leaders.
I have another question for you about whether or not Netanyahu is going to use Levin as a fool guy when the reforms fail. And maybe I could add to that, what do you think the chances are of the reforms failing?
It's hard to answer. Depends what day you ask me.
Sorry.
Sometimes I'm more optimistic, sometimes I'm more pessimistic. Look, we did have kind of a win. When was it? On Sunday? When was it, Leah? No, it was last Wednesday? Last week, when the Knesset had to elect its representatives for the committee of the selections of judges. Now, everything that went behind the scenes there is extremely complicated and vague, not transparent, because the elections were actually behind closed doors. They were not open elections. The bottom line, the end result was that in opposition of what Levin and Smotrich and Rothman planned and wanted, they wanted 2 members from the coalition to be selected to that committee. The end result was that only 1 member was elected, and she is from the opposition. There are many speculations there. Some speculate that this is actually what Netanyahu did want. And then it's just adding to the mythical perception of kind of a genius who eventually gets what he wants. But I'm not sure that that's really what he wanted, but it doesn't matter. Bottom line is that we succeeded, meaning that there were members from the coalition who actually voted for the opposition. And if you want to be optimistic, this is an indication that maybe there are indeed 4, maybe even 5 members from the coalition who, when they are not being watched, they actually oppose the coalition and the revolution and the overhaul and the reform. I don't know, it might be an indication. Tomorrow we are facing another extremely important day, because that's the day when the bar elections are going to take place. Now, I am a member of the bar for more than 30 years. I never paid my dues, and I never participated in any elections for the bar. 2 months ago, in order to be able to vote tomorrow, I paid a huge amount of money to renew my membership to be able to vote tomorrow. Now, just to give you the absurdity of where the situation of where Israel is, a person who competes to lead the bar, a former head of the Bar Association of Israel, had been convicted of, this is going to sound funny, of smuggling his, excuse my word, using this word, his mistress or his lover, smuggling her at the checkpoint of the border at the airport, because he didn't want her exit and entry to be registered so that his wife would not find out. Okay, he was convicted. But there is much, much, much more than that. This is one conviction, one formal conviction, but we know for a fact that he was involved in how do you say, in corrupt selection of judges, selection of corrupt judges, and corrupting the whole system of selection of judges. We know that for a fact. I can't go into details about why was it not formally indicted on that, but he's actually running to be again at the president of the Israeli Bar Association. And he might win because the coalition knows very well that he's going to collaborate with them. And if he wins, he can have control over the two representatives of the Bar Association to the committee of the selection of judges. And if that happens, that will give Levin, Minister of Justice, the control that he wants over the committee for the selection of judges. So it's
That's
very
so complicated, isn't it?
It's complicated to explain to the public what's at stake. I mean, you have to be like that. You if you don't pay attention for one moment, you lose the whole scope. And it's complicated to explain, but I think it shows how shaky this whole thing is. 1 minute we're winning, the other minute it may pass.
I would also add to that, I think it is important to note, I think it is important to note that the polls of the Israeli public at large still point to about 60, if not over 60% of the public opposing the reforms as they stand now. So even, as Ruth correctly said, I mean, every day is a new day and things change from minute to minute. But I think in general, across the board, the overwhelming majority of the public is not in favor of what is going on, period.
Mm-hmm.
Heather, you have a question. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yes, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
You're muted.
I did try to unmute it. Did that work?
It seemed to for a second and then it jumped back.
And what about now?
We can hear you.
Oh, yay. Thank you. So there's another group of women that I'm thinking about, and I haven't heard the word Arab used yet. And I sort of wonder about what the implications for the Arab Israelis and also the Arabs of the West Bank are, and for their women folk in particular. And if there's any reason for hope for them in this drive by a lot of people in the Israeli population for democracy.
Yeah.
That's a many question.
I indicated that the question of the ongoing conflict, the ongoing occupation, is in fact at the heart of everything, because the end game for the religious Zionists is to become an apartheid state. I think that there's no possibility to hide behind nicer words any longer. That's their end game, and weakening the Supreme Court and turning the government into an entity that can do anything that it wants is, of course, a necessary prerequisite to have this plan materialize. And that obviously means that non-Jews, Israeli or Palestinians in the West Bank, are going to find themselves in a much, much worse situation than they are now. Talking specifically about Arab women, Palestinian Israeli women, when I talked about increasing rates of violence against women, they are the victims. They are the direct victims. The numbers are staggering. We're at the middle of the year, and the numbers are already twice as many women members murdered, twice as many femicides as there were during all of the previous years, and they are unproportionately non-Jewish women. Now, that is related to the unprecedented rising levels of violence within the Arab population in Israel at large. But these levels, they indicate that the government completely lost control, or government doesn't really care about controlling violence within the Arab population. And femicides now are being conducted by the criminal groups. It's no longer the husband who himself murders his wife. It's the husband who orders a criminal, an assassin, a professional assassin, to murder his wife. That's what's happening. And that's the reality of Arab Israeli women now. One of the most difficult questions is, where are the Arab Israeli population within these protests and within the resistance movement? And again, it's very complicated. Again, you may see the pattern of leadership who is doing disservice to their constituency, to their population, disconnect between the leadership and the people. I have a very, very good colleague, friend on the law faculty at Bar Ilan University, who is Palestinian. She's a Christian, Palestinian Israeli. She does speak at demonstrations, but she constantly shares her frustration and her, ambivalence about, does she belong in this movement? Because this protest movement says we want Israel to keep being democracy. And she says, rightly, Israel has never been a true democracy, at least not for the past 50 years, and not with respect to the Arab Israeli citizens. So she says, how can I demonstrate for a democracy in which I don't believe? So it's really very, very complicated, but I do believe that we have to make compromises, and some of them have to take place now with respect to our allies and to our brothers and sisters who are non-Jewish, to unite now to together fight the very present danger, in the hope that afterwards we can really amend the deficiencies in our democracy previous to this current government.
Thank you. That's an amazing answer.
Leslie, did you want to add something to that question and answer?
Yes, please. Sorry. I can't get myself up, but anyway, thank you for all of that. I just wanted to, my question was also following along with what you've said, with the end result, the end aim being to get back the West Bank and all of that. Do you think that there will be a civil war in Israel?
Civil war among Jewish population?
Yes.
Look, we've already had a prime minister being assassinated by a Jewish assassin. And yet we managed to stay away from an overall war, civil war. I cannot say that I'm confident that we are able to stay away from that now, very much because the current leaders are just fueling the rates of violence are maddeningly increasing week by week. The violence against the protesters, the violence by the police. And I didn't even talk about the plans of the minister of so-called national security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is in charge of the police, and managed to get himself a private militia, right? And is now directing a bill, which is again on the table. It's on the table. A bill to be able to put into administrative arrest without a judicial overview, a judicial arrest, anybody within Israel. So the tool that was until now employed only against suspected terrorists can now be utilized against protesters without judicial review for 48 or for 96 hours. So again, these are just examples of how extreme, how far ahead this is already going on, and it just fuels and entices and encourages the illegitimacy that is attributed to those who protest. The word betrayers or traitors, the word traitors has become completely legitimate. The police just yesterday approved a demonstration that's going to take place, I don't know, maybe this week or next week in Jerusalem by those who support the reform, to hold banners, say leftists, traitors. Okay, this is going to be the sign of the demonstration. So I don't know what to say. It's very frightening. It's really very frightening.
Agnes has another question for you that might help you work out what to say next. Agnes.
Ruth, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. Can you elaborate, please, the question that I thought you raised, saying that Israel has actually never been a democracy. Can you elaborate, please?
If democracy's main principle, or one of the main principles, is equality to all those, to all its citizens, to all its residents, then you have to differentiate between de jure and de facto. But I would say that de jure, it never kept its promise for non-discrimination to its non-Jewish citizens and residents. That's number one. De jure, ever since the basic law of, how is it translated into English? basic law, Israel as the national basic law of Israel as the state for the Jewish nation.
National home of the Jewish people.
Thank you. National home for the Jewish people. Thank you, Leah. This basic law was enacted in 2016, a little less than 10 years ago. This actually enshrined in legislation, in the constitutional framework of Israel, it enshrined discrimination against non-Jews. Now, thinking about if you move away from formal definitions of constitutional framework of a state, and you do take into consideration all those who are subject to the control of the state, which would include people living in the West Bank, in the occupied Palestinian territories, then the answer to the question of was there democracy in that part of the control of Israel, I think the answer to that is pretty clear. So that's why I was saying that Israel's democracy was really lacking even before this judicial overhaul.
Ruth, can I just respond to that? And that is, when we're looking at democratic processes versus equal rights or humanitarian things, you would disqualify Australia as a democracy. You would disqualify the USA as a democracy. In fact, would there be any other country? If you're talking about discrimination, right? Yes, nobody would qualify. So there is the democratic organization versus discriminatory behavior. How can we call then any country a democracy?
That's a very, very good point. That's a very valid criticism of my position. But here I would answer that, at least with respect to the question of controlling your own life and participating in the democratic process, when it comes to the question of Israel's control over the West Bank, that's a different case from, as you rightly said, from Australia or from the US, because there you do have 2 million people or 3 million people who are lacking any possibility to participate in a democratic process.
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Agnes. I'm sorry. We could schedule another conversation on this topic because the whole topic of democracy is a very, very interesting one.
It is.
And if people would like to, please be in contact with me. It's just president@ncjw.org.au. So please be in contact about anything. But we made an extended time till 9:30, and I think Leah's children are going to be traumatized if she doesn't get to pick them up on time. And some of us are going to start wobbling and fall asleep, and Ruth must be exhausted after sharing such an enormous amount with us. What a talk, Ruth. That was absolutely fantastic. I think everyone, no matter how much they knew before they came, will have learnt an enormous amount. They will have new ideas. From the questions and discussion, we also have new ideas and new ways of thinking. So thank you very much. And Ruth, there have been lots of thanks in the chat for you.
Thank you.
I will finish off again by reminding you that we have the next event about the referendum on the 2nd of July. We also have something called Shabbos Table Talks, which is the opportunity for you to invite some people to your home and get information about the referendum to discuss. And that's a particularly good thing for you to do if you've just got people who don't know very much, want to read things, and have a conversation in your own home with your friends, completely private, just with some resources that could be useful. In the meantime, Ruth's given us a challenge of things to do. If anyone would like to help NCJW do any of those things, the more people we have a little subcommittee doing things, it would be great, because there's a limit to what we can currently do with our current very small cohort of people operating the organisation.